introduce this by saying I received a tremendous amount of help from Kathy Hopkinson with the numbers, so that way you'll believe them a lot more. Okay. And that I've tried to, and I want to present this, but I've tried to do this in more of a factual manner, not a manner in which I'm trying to say this is what we should do. So I want to present the issues in a slightly different way that hopefully will be more understandable. You know, as Kathy said, we need to either reduce costs or increase revenue. If not, I think we're headed for a fairly major financial crisis. We all understand that, you know, our job as a board is to manage a $270 million operation. These are our primary sources for income, and a lot of it comes from grants. But when you begin to look at it, our total budget is $271 million, but the general fund is $122.5 million of that. And I will say that the county has more control and more input associated with the general fund, because with the other funds, many of them are directed in certain ways or have to be spent in certain ways. And when you begin to look at some of the spreadsheets from Kathy, she really manages the county. She and her department really manage the county by fund more than budget. So we've all just, you know, completed a fairly major study of space needs in the kind of things that we need. These are the kind of facilities that we know we need to do something with. We also have an entire maintenance budget that's going to be completely used up in the next year. All of this stuff is needed, but how do we fund it? Particularly if we continue to use reserves to fund our general fund, we're not going to be able to easily get any financing from anyone. So that cannot happen if we continue to use reserves. So here in this sheet, you begin to look at, and if you look at the revenue and expenses row associated with this, okay, you can see where on average our difference between revenue and expenses is about $15 million. So we have to have a plan to make up and or exceed the changes that we have to do to that particular gap. So here are our major choices to increasing revenue. We've got the PTEL increases to property tax. We can increase our share of county motor fuel tax. We can reallocate RTA funds, or we can implement a sales tax. If we increase property tax, that has not been increased in 14 years. The current year's increase is maxed out at 3.4%. If we did that, that would give us about $2 million per year. And if we did that for 3 years, it would give us $6 million. So future increases are probably going to be tapped out at that $2 million level. So even increasing or even implementing the PTEL increase will not really cure that entire gap, but it's one of the things that we should consider as a start. Second is to increase the county motor fuel tax, as Kathy was pointing out. That would give us $7.15 million a year. And even though that goes to primarily to KDOT, it's still numbers that we can allocate that would help us to close that gap. And DuPage, McHenry, and Lake counties have already implemented either some or all of that particular increase. So it's not that we're going to be alone as a county doing this and bearing the brunt of it. DuPage County in particular, they're already over 9 cents, as Kathy mentioned earlier. Next is to reallocate the RTA tax. Currently, 75% goes to KDOT. I believe we're the only county that gives that much allocation to KDOT. So if we were to decrease that allocation to 50%, that would free up $6.3 million that could be allocated to the general fund. Okay. And our finance directors have been urging us to do that for several years. We could implement a 1% sales tax or some fraction thereof. If we did the 1% sales tax, that would increase our revenues by $60 million per year. It's the one that is the hardest one to do because that one's going to require that a referendum be passed. And other areas have done this, as Kathy was talking. When we begin to start looking at reducing costs, these are all of the elected officials, and I've included the chief judge, even though he's not directly elected by the people. He is elected by the judges, and he is responsible for a fairly substantial part of his budget. Oh, yeah. So these are the departments that we need to talk about. We've got some that are partially funded and some that are funded independently of the general fund. So I've eliminated these departments that are really funded independently. They don't get any funding or they get very little funding from the general fund. That brings us back to these departments. And if you're going to start looking at ways to cut, okay, the key variable is people. So reducing staff would have to be very key to what happens. And I now have what's coming up are the personnel numbers that's first associated to those departments that are managed by the elected officials, and then those that are managed by the county. So if you look here first at the sheriff department, as you see, and by the way, I spoke with the sheriff and the state's attorney, and I left messages for the chief judge so that they were prepared for some of the kinds of things coming out of the presentation and understood that we're not necessarily allocating, but that we do this. But if we're going to do this, if we start, the key thing we're going to be looking at is a 10% reduction in these departments. And if we did it by reducing personnel, assuming that the average pay with benefits was around $60,000, okay, in total, we'd be looking at 226 people, but we'd be looking at almost 60 people out of the sheriff's department and another 32 people out of the state's attorney's office. Now, I've been on this board for a short while, but while we've been here in particular, you know, the state's attorney came to us and had us increase personnel that were directed at people trafficking and personnel that were directed to look into child pornography. Those are the kinds of things we should be doing. Those are not the kinds of things we should be cutting. I also want to note that I've been advised that any cuts to public safety will probably initiate a lawsuit. We look at the other major departments and the cuts in personnel. All of these would be substantial. So we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20% of our workforce if we do all of the cuts by personnel. And we'll have to do something because we cannot operate in a deficit budget. So again, here are our major choices. The PTEL increase is 2 million or 6 million over the next 3 years if we were to do that. Increasing the gas tax would give us 7.15 million. Reallocating the RTA tax would give us 6.3 million. And implementing a 1% sales tax would be 60 million, 30 million if we did a 0.5% sales tax. And then the other choice is significant cuts to personnel. And what I'm after, Mr. Chairman, is we need a plan now.
Definitely.
It's inappropriate for us to talk about these issues and then go to our department managers and say, we want you to come forth with a budget for next year when we can't give them the parameters on the limits of what it is or the direction of what we want to do in order to give them a primary definition of the funds that are available. Okay? So we can't continue to ignore this. We need to do this now.
The